Our effort is to integrate our economies with the developed world who believe in fair play, who believe in honest business practices. I think this reset that the world is going through is actually very good for the world. We could trust them to behave better. Sadly, that never happened.
Welcome to GBS Deep Dive. I'm Najma Minhas. While most of us during the past couple of weeks have been focused on Asia's largest economy, China, India, Asia's now most populated country, has been busy making its own moves to stay out of the Trump administration's wrath and at the same time sell itself as the Made in India as a cheaper manufacturing hub, the alternative to Made in China. News came out last week how Apple sped up iPhone shipments from India, 600 tons of iPhones, worth almost $2 billion, as a way to beat the tariffs, which were later suspended anyway. India currently faces 10% tariffs during these 90 days pause, down from the earlier 26% that President Trump imposed. The rates, even if they increased again, would mean that India still faces much lower rates as compared to others in the region, including Vietnam at 46%, Thailand at 36%, and China, of course, at 145%. So many see this as an opportunity for Indian companies to make inroads into the US market. However, at a time when most countries have decried and rebuked the Trump administration for its tariffs as threatening the world economy, India's Commerce Minister last week, Piyush Goyal, called the US reciprocal tariffs as an opportunity of a lifetime, and even more surprisingly, blamed China for the current turmoil in the global economy, saying it was all due to China joining the World Trade Organization, the WTO, almost 25 years ago.
Genesis of this entire problem goes back to the late 80s and mid 90s when China was accepted in the World Trade Organization.
His words were a direct echo of the United States' own rhetoric on China and believed to be India trying to pave the way for a better India-US trade pact, as well as trying to remove the US attention from President Trump's own rhetoric, who has since his first administration often called India the tariff abuser and the tariff king.
India, which is the tariff king.
The country currently has a $46 billion trade deficit with the United States in goods exported to the US. The problem is that such kowtowing has traditionally not worked on Trump, who has described nations as kissing my ass to make trade deals.
I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up, kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal. Please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything, sir.
And tries to wring out even more out of them when they try to please him. India, like many other Southeast Asian states, faces a potential crisis and an opportunity to benefit from the economic warfare that the US is imposing against China as part of its own existential struggle for power. The trade war that started under the first Trump administration helped India rise as companies adopted a China plus one approach. And now Trump's second one could be transformative for the country. So the question is this India's moment? Can India take China's mantle in manufacturing? What does it need in place? What's going right for India and what's not so good? Thank you for joining me today. Do like and subscribe to the channel and do share the video to anybody you think might find it interesting. India needs to create millions of jobs annually to absorb its young and growing labor force. Manufacturing offers labor-intensive employment, particularly for semi-skilled workers, which is vital since the country's service sector doesn't generate enough jobs for this demographic. According to the World Bank, over 12 million Indians enter the workforce every year. Now, India has a very strong service sector, which accounts for almost 53% of its GDP. By comparison, manufacturing only accounts for around 17%, as compared to 27% in China. Currently, less than 3% of all global manufacturing takes place in this world's most populous country, compared to 24% for China. The Indian government plans to increase India's share of global manufacturing to 5% by 2030 and 10% by 2047. India is actively pursuing strategies to enhance its position as a global manufacturing hub, aiming to rival China's dominance, and its mobile phone policy is an interesting case study in what went right for India. However, India still has a massive reliance on imports for critical components from China, including semiconductors. Much of its industrial base is an assembly line process, which relies heavily on Chinese intermediate goods, raw materials, capital equipment, and technology, as well as investment to produce the final products for export, particularly to the United States. For example, although India has made strides in improving its electronic manufacturing ecosystem, the country still imports a significant portion of the components needed for the smartphone production from China. It's currently very difficult for India to move into high-value manufacturing, where China is moving towards right now, since it heavily relies on China for multiple inputs. And certainly, it cannot antagonize China if it wants to move in that direction. Right now, the United States accepts a 35% value addition in India as sufficient for its rules of origin certificate. That allows India to import Chinese components, assemble them together, and export the finished good to America, and still for it to be called Made in India. However, we know that from Mexico and Vietnam, the United States is closely looking at this. It knows that many Chinese imports come into the US via this mechanism. Since 2018, after Trump's first trade war, as major global companies started moving manufacturing to US-friendly countries, which is called friendshoring, India was one of the major beneficiaries of global tech giants moving into the country. Major companies like Apple, Samsung, and Google expanded their manufacturing operations in India. Apple, for instance, now produces iPhones in India. 1 in 5 of Apple mobiles is being produced in the country, with exports exceeding $22 billion last year in 2024. And by 2027, it wants to move towards producing 1 in 4 of its phones, 25%, in India. Apple now accounts for around 65% of all Indian smartphone exports. This strategic geopolitical positioning India continues to tap into is evidenced by those deliberate comments by the Indian Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, who portrayed China as a bad global player versus India as a team player. India is positioning itself as a key alternative amid this global efforts to diversify supply chains away from China. The Indian government has launched initiatives and incentives for manufacturing through programs like Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat that have been pivotal in promoting domestic manufacturing. The PLI scheme, the production-linked incentive that the government introduced, has attracted substantial investments across many sectors, including the electronics, pharmaceuticals, textiles, and have generated nearly 1 million jobs over 4 years. While the scheme has been successful in these sectors like electronics and pharmaceuticals, it has underperformed in many others, such as steel and solar panels, which is one of the reasons why this scheme is actually now being put aside. Unlike many other sectors, though, India's smartphone production-linked incentive scheme, the PLI scheme, has generated 19 times its investment, yielding massive revenues for the government. India has become the second largest smartphone manufacturer in the world after China. And the country now produces over 300 million smartphones annually. And the production value of these is almost close to $50 billion last year in 2024. The achievement is not just about volume, but also about value-added production occurring within India. By 2024, smartphone exports alone constituted more than half of India's total electronic exports, reflecting that sector's growing dominance in the country. Global giants like Foxconn, Pegatron, and Wistron, which supply components for companies like Apple, have significantly expanded their manufacturing capacity in the country. While Apple leads the charge, Samsung also plays a critical role in India's electronic export success. Samsung's vast manufacturing facility in Noida contributes significantly to India's export figures. And the company's smartphones, along with its semiconductors and display technologies, have been a key component of the country's rising export profile. Samsung accounts for around 22% of India's smartphone export value as of last year, 2024. Interestingly, to avail the friendshoring benefits, even Chinese brands like Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo and Realme have all expanded their manufacturing footprint in India. These companies, though, focus primarily on the domestic market in India itself, but they do benefit from the country's growing role in the global electronic supply chains, especially as the Indian government incentivizes local production for export. Apple's own expansion in India is estimated will create up to 600 jobs by the end of fiscal year 2025, including 200,000 direct roles at factories operating by suppliers like Foxconn and Pegatron. Then there is the multiplier effect, which could generate millions of indirect jobs across, for example, logistics, component manufacturing, and retail. India's done a fantastic job on smartphones, and it was helped by that long-term secular shift in the global manufacturing landscape and the global supply chains away from China. It's not going to be easy to take away that Chinese crown. The country has 3 significant obstacles holding it back from the manufacturing hub status: restrictive labor laws, inadequate quality of their infrastructure and land issues, and a massively inefficient tariff and licensing regime. While India has a large labor pool, it faces huge challenge in providing a sufficiently skilled workforce for advanced manufacturing, including robotics, artificial intelligence, and automation, which are needed to stay competitive in the global manufacturing market, and especially in the high-value manufacturing where real profits are made. Wages have already been rising in India, potentially impacting their cost competitiveness for that country at the lower end of the manufacturing chain, which is where generally they are right now. However, they're still way lower than the average wages in manufacturing in China, but they're already higher than Vietnam, which is India's real competition in manufacturing, not China. The country's labor laws and courts are notorious for their obstacles. In 2017, General Motors decided to shut their plants in Gujarat and Maharashtra due to the low sales that they had in the country. But unions actually opposed the closures, and GM only received its judicial approval to exit India completely in January 2024, almost 7 years after they actually wanted to close the company down. In much of India, firms with more than 100 employees need authorization from state governments to actually hire and fire people. There has been a massive improvement recently under the Modi government as the government hugely increased its spending on infrastructure. For example, the National Highway Network nearly tripled in length from around 52,000 kilometers in the year 2000 to over 146,000 kilometers last year, so adding an average of around 3,900 kilometers each year. However, India's infrastructure still lags behind China's, and it affects the overall logistics and the supply chain efficiency. Land issues are also rife in the country. For example, industrial groups have to go through very difficult processes to acquire large plots of land that they need to set up manufacturing facilities. Title deeds are often very unclear, and holdings are often very fragmented. In May 2024 last year, Foxconn, whose local investment was trumpeted as a major success by the Prime Minister himself, Prime Minister Modi, was met with protests later by farmers in Karnataka who were unhappy with the compensation that they received from the local authorities for giving up their land, who then sold it to the manufacturer, Foxconn in this case. Complex regulations, bureaucratic processes, India's license raj deters investment, and it complicates business operations. Then it's not without a cause that Trump says India is the tariff king. The average import tariff imposed by India on WTO members was around 18.1%. Now compare this to China at 7.5%. On cars, for example, India has tariffs charging up to 110%. Generally, the United States bilateral charges on India are only around 2.2%. Under the trade deal that India is very keen to achieve, it is expected to reduce tariffs. Imports can clear customs in China, for example, for about 20 hours. By comparison, it takes over 44 to 85 hours in India, according to a government study in India in 2023. India is making strides in becoming a player in global manufacturing, particularly in electronics and pharmaceuticals. Currently, India, though, only accounts for around 3% of all imported goods to the United States. And India is keen on taking that bilateral trade between the two countries to around $500 billion. However, fully replacing China in the near term is unlikely due to China's own established infrastructure, its skill base, its integrated supply chains, and manufacturing expertise. Realistically, however, it's not China. India's nearest competitor is actually Vietnam, who even now exports miles more manufacturing goods than India does. And if the news that Vietnam is offering the Trump administration zero tariffs in return is true, India will be in serious trouble with its manufacturing dreams. Share with me your comments on India's emergence as a manufacturing powerhouse. Thank you for giving me your time today, and do share the video and subscribe to the channel. See you soon.